Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Ogbanje Joseph. Please subscribe to this channel, share, like, as well as drop a comment on the comment section. Our lecture today is titled Historical Evolution of Diplomacy. Historical Evolution of Diplomacy. The beginning of organized diplomacy is the relations among city-states of ancient Greece. By the 5th century BC, Nicholson stated, special missions between Greek city-states had become so frequent that something approaching our own system of regular diplomatic intercourse has been achieved. Thucydides wrote much about diplomatic procedure among the Greeks. For instance, in his account of a conference at Sparta in 432 BC, the Spartans and their allies considered what action should be taken against Athens. The Romans did little to advance the art of diplomacy by negotiation, but they did make important contributions to international law. In the Eastern Roman Empire, which was established after Constantine had moved his capital to the city that honored him for many centuries, diplomatic methods were employed with great effect. The Eastern emperors had marked success in playing off potential rivals against each other, and the reports of their representatives at foreign courts gave them information which they were able to utilize to their advantage. Their representatives therefore became skilled diplomats and trained observers, thus extending the practice of diplomacy to include accurate observation and reporting as well as representation. Until the later 18th or early 19th century, diplomacy more often meant the study and preservation of archives than the act of international negotiation. This conception was especially prevalent in the Middle Ages. It was in papal and other chanceries under the direction and authority of successive master of the rolls that the usages of diplomacy as a science based upon precedent and experience first came to be established. Now let us look at the origin of modern diplomacy. Now, the modern diplomacy as an organized profession arose in Italy in the late Middle Ages. The rivalries of the Italian city-states and the methods, which their rulers used to promote their interests are described in masterful fashion in Machiavelli's The Prince. The Holy See and the Italian city-states developed systems of diplomacy at an early date. There are views that the Holy See was the first to utilize a system of permanent representation, which is the characteristic feature of modern diplomacy. However, the first known permanent mission was established at Genoa in 1455 by Francesco Strozza, Duke of Milan. During the following century, Italian city-states established permanent embassies in London and Paris, and Francis I of France devised something like a permanent, diplomatic mission. However, for over 3 centuries, the mission was neither adequate nor standardized. Diplomacy was still the diplomacy of the courts. Its object was to promote the interests of the sovereign abroad by various means, direct or devious, fair or foul, and its standards were low and ill-defined. The ambassador then, as now, was deemed to be the personal representative of his head of state in a foreign country. An affront to him was an affront to the head of state himself, and hence to the nation that they symbolized. In the absence of well-defined rules of procedure, frequent disputes, sometimes so bitter as to lead to duels or even to wars, arose from questions of precedence and immunity. Ambassadors who attempted to entertain in a style befitting the dignity of their sovereigns often found themselves in their financial straits, especially if the sovereign whose dignity they were trying to enhance by sumptuous display neglected to pay them salaries. Okay, so by the 17th century, permanent missions were the rule, rather than the exception, and diplomacy had become established profession and a generally accepted mission. Okay, a generally accepted method of international intercourse. Let me take it again. By the 17th century, permanent missions were the rule rather than the exception, and diplomacy had become established profession and a generally accepted method of international intercourse. The rise of nationalism and nation-state system made such machinery essential, especially after the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 has crystallized and formalized the state system. Diplomats from all European countries, as well as noblemen and other countries from all parts of France, graced the court of Louis, the 26th, and gave it the pomp and splendor which dazzled his contemporaries and set a pattern for decades to come. Many other monarchs of Europe tried, but not too successful, to copy the Sun King and to establish their own courts of vassals. The diplomacy of the courts entered its golden age in the 18th century. The game came to be played according to understood rules, with a great deal of glitter represented their sovereigns and were of glitter. Okay, so that the diplomacy of the courts entered its golden age in the 18th century. The game came to be played according to understood rules, with a great deal of glitter on the surface and much incompetence and intrigue beneath. Diplomats represented their sovereigns and were often merely the willing tools in the great context for empire and for European supremacy that were waged in the century. Strong rulers, strong rulers like Peter the Great of Russia and Frederick the Great of Prussia used diplomacy and force to achieve their ends. The same comment might be made of important ministers of state, men like Pitt the Elder and Vergennes. By the 18th century, the industrial American and French revolutions had ushered in a new era of diplomacy and indeed of history. Captains and kings passed from the scene in many lands, and the voice of the people began to be heard. The unassuming figure of Benjamin Franklin in the streets of Paris and London, representing a nation and the making, symbolized the coming era of more diplomacy. To attempt to represent a nation rather than ruler imposed more complicated duties on the diplomat. Indeed, it called for a new land of diplomat, but the remuneration remained so inadequate that the diplomatic profession was still largely confined to those who have other sources of income. Inevitably, this meant that so-called democratic diplomacy was still carried on by representatives of aristocracy, of wealth, and often of rank. Okay, as diplomacy as diplomacy became less formal and restricted, its rules became more standardized and more generally accepted. The Congress of Vienna made particularly important contribution in this respect. To place diplomacy on more systematic and formal basis, the Congress laid down certain rules of procedure which are still commonly observed. These rules were embodied in the Reglement of March 1815 and in regulations of the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1818. The present diplomacy can be said to have started in the 19th century, which then demanded new methods as well as new personnel. These methods were defined in many international agreements and became an intricate and generally observed code. Under the aegis of the Holy Alliance and the concert of Europe, buttressed by the operations of the balance of power system, the game was played according to new rules with fair degree of success. Thank you very much.